Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. We'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Lessons Learned, Moving from NetExpress to Visual COBOL. We hope you find this webinar both useful and applicable to either your current or future projects. Today's webinar is brought to you by Vivid's COBOL Special Interest Group, or SIG. The COBOL SIG leader is Jerome Rose, who is pictured here. I'll be your moderator today. My name is Graham Bartholomew. A little bit background about myself. I have over 20 years experience developing distributed and mainframe COBOL applications. I've worked for several Fortune 500 clients early in my career, but now my focus is on actuarial software in the insurance industry. I've held multiple positions during my career, including software designer, team lead, and instructor, both in the classroom and more recently on video. So now I want to introduce to you today the speakers that we have. Jerome Rose is the first speaker. He's a business systems analyst at Infosys. As I mentioned earlier, he's a Vivid COBOL SIG leader, and he has over 25 years experience as a mainframe COBOL developer analyst, and most recently as a business system analyst in the distributed platform. He has interacted with many clients across several markets, but will definitely be sharing his experience in two key areas today, and that will be healthcare and finance. And our second speaker will be Blair McDonald, who is a principal support engineer at Micro Focus. He joined Micro Focus in 2012, but he started using the company's COBOL products as a developer in 1988. He's also worked as a trainer teaching COBOL and the use of Micro Focus products. And before we get started, there's a couple of housekeeping items that I'll go over. So today's live session is intended for all Vivid members. And after the webinar today, the recording, slide deck, and questions and answers will all be posted to the Vivid website. A link will be provided via email once they are posted to the website. If you have questions as we go along, and this is important, please type them in using the questions pane in the webinar control panel. I'll show this in the next slide. So here's a picture of the GoToWebinar control panel that usually will appear in your upper right-hand corner of the screen. In order to submit a question, make sure the questions pane is expanded and type in your question and then click on send. So now that we've finished up with those introductions and housekeeping items, I'd like to get started, and I'm going to pass it over to Jerome Rose.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jerome. I'm the Special Interest Group leader from the Chicago area for COBOL. So I'm currently with Infosys. My experience for the last 25 years has been mainly in the mainframe area as a developer. I've done systems analysis work and business systems analysis work. And I have one recent project that I want to talk to you about that was on a distributed platform with Micro Focus COBOL. And the reason I wanted to have this presentation was because we ran into some challenges, and we were able to overcome those obstacles, and I think it would be worthwhile to share those with other people so that you would have this knowledge under your belt if in case you ever come across these situations. I think it would be better to know beforehand how to overcome these challenges. Next slide, please. Okay, so the infrastructure upgrade project that I'm referring to had to do with these components that you see on the screen. It had to do with migrating from Unix to Linux. We used the Red Hat distribution. We upgraded from Micro Focus NetExpress to Visual COBOL. There was a Java upgrade. There was an upgrade of the client's scheduling manager. And in addition, the file shares were updated to the net attached storage. So this is the background. All these components were upgraded, and I was responsible for the COBOL implementation part of it. And so the presentation will be in two parts. For the first part, I'll just talk about a few of the challenges that we overcame having to do with COBOL based on these components, on the upgrade of all of these individual components, moving parts, you can call them. And the second part, I'll just mention some performance management techniques that we used after we implemented to make sure that everything was running correctly. Next slide, please. So the advantages of migrating from Unix to Linux are that Linux is open sourced, you have more community support, you get faster updates, and it's designed as a general purpose scalable platform for a broad set of applications. And you have a choice of distributions. Usually for larger companies, they'll use Red Hat, but you don't have to use Red Hat. You have, like I said, quite a choice. And Linux supports all file systems that are used across all operating systems, and it's the preferred operating system for cloud deployment and data centers, primarily for economic reasons. It's more cost effective. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay. As far as the upgrade from NetExpress to Visual COBOL, the advantages you get with Visual COBOL are that you get object orientation, you get to use all the APIs, and maybe the biggest one is that you have access to the .NET, complete access to the .NET and Java frameworks. That is a big deal. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, thank you. So let me show you what the plan was. I heard that Linux is Unix and Unix is Linux, and the first day of the project, the testing manager said it should work. You should not have any problems. They're both the same thing. Well, they are very similar, but they're not exactly the same. So this upgrade was totally lift and shift. There was no changing of functionality. There was no inclusion of any like to haves. It was all must haves. And we just carried over all the Micro Focus COBOL source code intact. Like I said, no new functionality, no database changes, and we had assurances from the DBAs that all the database connections are all as they should be. So as far as the plan goes, what we did was we did regression testing of the COBOL programs in each staging environment in each region of Unix, and then tested the same programs under Linux in each stage environment. So we managed to succeed. We overcome a few obstacles going from Unix to Linux and NetExpress to Visual COBOL, and those obstacles were resolved by either changing one of the scripts that were changed from using Linux to using Unix to using Linux, maybe changing an environment variable, or sometimes the scheduler, and in rare instances, the COBOL program needed to be changed. But out of the 834 COBOL programs that are now Visual COBOL, very few of them, thankfully, need to be changed. It went very smooth in that regard. There were, however, a few programs that were suffering from performance degradation that we'll talk about later. Thankfully, again, there's only a few of those. So we'll get to that later. Okay. So here's the first challenging incident that I want to talk about. It has to do with executing a COBOL program on the new system in Linux, but it doesn't produce any output. So if you remember the first slide where I showed you that there were many moving parts, there was a scheduling manager, there was a Java upgrade, there was Unix to Linux, there's NetExpress to COBOL. All these moving parts made it difficult to know exactly where the problem was coming from. So, you know, we never knew if the Java program was feeding us the right data, or if an environment variable was filled out, or if the schedule was being run correctly. So in this situation here, like I say, the application ran fine, the COBOL program was executed, but it didn't produce any output. So we located the script that was involved inside the COBOL program and discovered that during this lift and shift operation, whereby we took the COBOL program that ran fine in Unix, the same COBOL program, and when we run it in Linux, it doesn't do anything in terms of invoking the script. So what we had to do as a resolution is to make a slight change to how the data was being loaded into the script. So before you invoke this, before you down here is what I'm talking about, before you call system to invoke the script, when you load the values before you execute the string command, you need to move low values to the end of that string. So in Unix, you don't have to do anything. In Unix, it just ran fine. In Linux, it did not run at all. It didn't invoke the script at all until we terminated the end of the string with low values. So, you know, this may seem minor and inconsequential when I show this to you now, but when you're actually in the project and COBOL is responsible for holding up the entire project and people are wondering when you're going to fix it and when Java is going to be able to run and so on and so forth, then it becomes a big deal. So I'm just hoping that if you have prior knowledge about these things, that will help you in the future. Let's look at our next challenge. So we had a situation where we were executing the Visual COBOL, the new lift and shifted COBOL program in running the Visual COBOL program in Linux, and none of the files were being printed. So, you know, you go down to the print shop expecting just to be able to pick up the file, pick up the paperwork to prove that you can now execute exactly like you were doing in Unix, and you get nothing. There's nothing to be picked up. So what we found out was, first of all, that you should not update the bash profile. That was our first instinct because we had success doing that in something similar prior to this. But you should resist that temptation. Do not update the bash profile because it will impact you negatively in other processes. So what we ended up doing was just issuing the echo command in the code, and that enabled the print line break, and it printed out the printer just fine with no negative impacts. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here is a situation where some data was being entered on a screen. It was being ingested by the COBOL program. The COBOL program was then responsible for displaying that data on another screen. And so when the user, the client, entered the data, it entered fine. They thought everything was fine. We go to the next screen, however, and it wasn't fine. It was being truncated. So what we found out was that in Unix, when you use the AWK file processing system, it'll work just fine. But that AWK in this particular instance, for this particular script, did not work. So it was truncating the timestamp, so you'd get the date but not the time. So we ended up modifying that script, the COBOL microfocus dynamic script, to use the SCG, the stream editor, and that worked in Linux. So that was not an easy thing to discover, but thankfully we did, and it worked fine. So this next obstacle here, this is something that I'm not used to because I've never seen this happen on the mainframe, but in a distributed system, we had a situation where the COBOL program was executing fine, it was working, but when it went to write out a file, if you look at how the writing was done, there was no problem in the code, but it would just abort and it would not write out. We kind of wasted some time with this. The resolution to this was very, very simple. We just deleted the output file. It was corrupted somehow. We just recreated the file and it worked fine. So it's the lift and shift worked fine here. We just lifted that program. We didn't need to change it at all, and then it worked fine. Okay. So what I found out, kind of wish I knew beforehand, is some best practices, and that is that this is not something that's being done in isolation. You really need to involve your team. I'm talking about your infrastructure team, your system administrators. In my situation, I did not have root access. So I had to depend on system administrators and the infrastructure folks. What I want to point out is that the DBA needs to be involved. They need heads up to know what you're going to be testing. And I also want to point out that when I say we're talking about performance management, remember this is the second part, so we're done with the challenges, we're talking about performance management now. When I say performance management, I'm not talking about modifying the Linux kernel. That's not what we're referring to here. So I want you to make sure that you don't let anybody tell you that, because somebody told me that, and I didn't know that it was not the case at the time. I'm also talking about the fact that you should never try to nice or re-nice the Linux values to change the priority of the job's execution. That's not COBOL performance management. So just be aware of that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as far as attacking performance management to make sure that your system is operating as it should, there are the traditional 4 pillars that apply to any kind of system, whether it's COBOL or not. And it has to do with the CPU, the memory, the disk, I/O, and the network. So some of these things, you as a COBOL person will just be observing, and some of these things you will need to make requests of your infrastructure people in order to get them involved, because they're the ones who actually do the changing. Your involvement in this analysis of performance management with regards to these 4 pillars is usually that you're the one just running the job. So they're going to set up some attributes to change, for example, the CPU to determine if you're using too much or too little. You'll run the job. When the job is finished running, then you'll check the performance and you'll make a decision. It's a cost-benefit analysis, whether lowering or raising the CPU is going to bring you the performance management benefits that you're seeking. In our case, changing the CPU had no effect at all, so we just left it as it was. With memory, I asked the infrastructure folks to increase, we did some experiments, some tests, we increased it, we decreased it. What we found was that a slight increase in memory gave us a performance benefit, but it became a matter of diminishing returns. The more memory you increase did not bring any better performance. So we just left it as it was with a slight increase. Now, as far as disk I/O and network goes, there are some commands that you can set up. I'll just give you my experience, what I did. I was able to set this up and request that the systems administrator run them in order to check the disk I/O. So I'm now talking about the third bullet item, the disk I/O and the network. And so in our case, both of those showed excellent performance. We didn't need to change anything. So when you're doing performance management, as long as you take care of these 4 main things to begin with, you have a good solid foundation, so that when someone wants to know how your system is performing, you can come back to them. And if you're going to go to the cloud, you're probably going to be involved in optimizing the system. So it is good to be familiar with these things. So there's one other thing I want to point out, and that is that there's a wild card in all this, and that has to do with some externalities or things that you may not think of, things that are outside this realm of traditional performance management, such as the last bullet point I'm talking about. There was an antivirus that was installed on the Unix system, on the old system. Sorry, it's the other way around. The Unix didn't have any. The Unix did not have any antivirus. So when you're not really comparing apples to apples at that point, because Linux, the new system, had Sophos. So they put antivirus software on the Linux, and in some cases we did have performance degradation, but that's definitely, you can show it empirically. You can see that there was performance issues related to installing antivirus. So you have the antivirus, it runs faster. Sorry, you have the antivirus, it runs slower. You take the antivirus off, and it runs better. So what I'm pointing out is that there may be some wildcards, some external factors that you need to consider. Next slide, please. So here are the tools that we ended up using. These are free tools that are in Linux, free diagnostics tools. One of them is called strace, and there are several options that you can use with strace to see what your system is doing. And the second one is TCP dump, and the TCP dump will show you how the network is performing. So what you do is you run the TCP dump, your system admin, whoever has root access rights, has to run it, and it creates these PCAP files, and then you just run the PCAP files through a tool called Wireshark, and Wireshark's been out for a while, and Wireshark does a pretty good job of giving you some visuals to show you how well your network is performing, how well your application is performing over the network, I should say. Okay. Now, in addition to free diagnostic tools on Linux, there are also some built-in tools in Micro Focus. So for Micro Focus performance, there is, for example, a tool called Profiler with an R at the end there. So that's a Micro Focus compiler directive, and it will create a report showing you how much percentage of time that a program spends in each COBOL routine. So this could be enormously helpful if you think that one of your routines should not be spending that much time, and and the profiler shows that you're spending a lot of time. Well, obviously you have a problem there, right? So the way you set that up is to install this Micro Focus directive as the first line in your source code, and that's where that dollar in this bullet point. Yeah, in the first bullet point I'm referring to, you have a dollar set profile without the R. You put that as the first line of your code. It's going to create a .ipf file after you execute the application, and you're going to convert that file using Profiler. So Profiler is a utility that you're going to run to create a file, because you can't see the IPF file. It's not visible. You have to convert it. In our case, yeah, it didn't really help in our case, but it is a very valuable tool. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here's a slide that's just showing you the nuts and bolts of how to use another Micro Focus tool called Consolidated Trace Facility, or CTF. So there's two ways you can do it. You can create a directory, activate it. You need to export some values and then run your application. You could also set the values in the bash profile. That's not the preferred way to do it, though. You may get excess tracing. So that, if you remember anything about the mainframe days, this is the same as Ready Trace, or in COBOL 2, it was on the mainframe, it was called exhibit name. This is the same concept. It's allowing you detailed tracing of your application from the COBOL program. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to point out that there have been some recent enhancements to Consolidated Trace. This is readily available on the Micro Focus website, the documentation. This is basically showing you that there's a dynamic way to invoke this from Eclipse. This is an easier way to do that. And the next slide, please. And here I'm just pointing out that when you're using Enterprise Server, if your application was a transformation from a mainframe system, you would do the tracing a different way. You would locate a directory on the Enterprise Server. It's called Micro Focus COBOL ES, and you would execute it from there. So I didn't do this because we didn't have Enterprise Server, but this is just another way to do it. If you do have Enterprise Server, this is the way you would do it. Okay, so it's time for questions, and I hope either myself or Blair can answer all your questions. And by the way, I do want to point out that if you haven't yet taken advantage of the Microfocus videos on YouTube, they were created by Blair. Please do so. It will enhance and enrich your experience using Microfocus.
Great,
So do we have
thanks,
any
Jerome.
questions? Sure.
Jerome, we're going to be reading the questions from the questions pane here, and I'd like to encourage anyone, if you haven't asked a question yet, go out there and enter some questions into the pane. But the first question is, if I move from Unix to Linux, what flavors of Linux does Visual COBOL support?
Hi, this is Blair McDonald from Microfocus Customer Support. I'll go ahead and take that question. So currently, Visual COBOL supports for Linux, the Red Hat, Oracle Linux, and SUSE Linux are the currently supported flavors. But I'll make mention of the fact that the current version of Visual COBOL is 5.0. The new version 6.0 is coming out next month. And one of the things added in 6.0 is support for Ubuntu and CentOS. So there will be additional support for those platforms in the new 6.0 version.
Okay, thanks. We'll move on to the next question, which is, can we use Visual COBOL on the mainframe?
This is Blair McDonald again. There is support for being able to use COBOL, Visual COBOL on distributed platforms, and then there is a separate product called Enterprise Developer that supports mainframe compatible development. So being able to do development for applications that were originally built on the mainframe. So the Visual COBOL product itself does not support mainframe COBOL, but the companion or associated product, Enterprise Developer, does support mainframe development.
Okay, great. We're getting a lot of questions coming in right now, so that's awesome. Did you use any tool to transform from NetExpress COBOL to Visual COBOL? I think this would be for Jerome.
Yeah. So no, we didn't. We used the build script that we used for each of the staging environments to migrate the programs to. So we didn't do anything special as far as that. In other words, we basically, instead of bringing in the NetExpress programs into the build script, we brought in the Visual COBOL programs.
Okay, great. Another question is, what is the end of support expectation for AIX and other Unix Server Express platforms?
That I don't know.
So
and then go ahead.
I'll weigh in with a little bit of information about that, because you can certainly reach out to Microfocus customer support to get details about, and there's actually a product availability page on the support line website at supportline.microfocus.com that shows the current status of support and the expected end of life for a particular Microfocus product. Generally speaking, Server Express is still supported on multiple platforms, but as platforms are upgraded by their respective vendors, support is not being added to Server Express for those newer operating system versions, and so at that point you may be looking at using Visual COBOL instead.
Okay, great. Another question is, do COBOL programs with pointers logic compile successfully in Visual COBOL?
Yes, they should. You may have to change some storage associated with pointers because of potential move from a 32 to 64-bit execution environment if you choose to go to 64-bit. There might be a consideration there, but the general answer to the question is yes.
Okay. All right, we're getting a lot of questions coming in now. What specific version of RHEL or SUSE or Oracle Linux is supported by Visual COBOL, and is there any dependency on the version the version of database versions of PostgreSQL and MySQL?
We weren't using MySQL as a database, but as far as the version goes, we just use the latest Red Hat version.
And the general answer is that because, of course, as new versions of Visual COBOL are released, they have been tested with a given version of external products such as operating systems, databases, and so forth. So the answer is going to vary based on which version you're looking at. Just to throw a couple of answers at you, the new version of Visual COBOL I was talking about is going to work with Red Hat 6, 7, or I believe 8, and with SUSE 12 and SUSE 15. I'll have to look for the answer for Postgres and MySQL. But again, the information about compatibility, tested compatibility, is available on the support line website, so you can look for that there.
Okay. Another question is, does Visual COBOL support DB2 database?
Yes, Visual COBOL can work with the DB2 database.
Okay. And, can you restate the point that you mentioned for 32 to 64-bit migration, please?
With Visual COBOL, in most environments, you have the option of working in either 32 or 64-bit mode. And often applications have been developed historically to work in a 32-bit environment. And the size of the pointers storage that is used in that environment is different than what's required if you decide to change your application to instead run in 64-bit mode. So in those cases, you may have to actually go back to the portion of the code where the pointer variables are defined and increase their size to support the size of pointer that's required in 64-bit mode.
Okay, is there any more questions out there? You still have some time to enter them in. Oh, here we go. When we migrate Micro Focus NetExpress to Visual COBOL, what IDE do we use for debugging the application? Does it support a VB application? If yes, does it need any change in the COBOL programs which integrate with the VB screen?
You should be using Eclipse, I would say.
Well, there are two different IDEs that are available, okay? There's Visual COBOL for Eclipse, and there's Visual COBOL for Visual Studio. The Eclipse IDE is well targeted to applications that are going to be running on Unix or Linux platforms, or applications that need to make use of the Java technology stack. If instead you're working with an application that is going to be principally running on Windows and maybe is going to be making use of Windows specific functionality or things like .NET, then you'd probably want to work with the Visual COBOL for Visual Studio product instead.
Okay, great. All right, another question is Visual COBOL on Windows compatible with VB6?
I can't really address, at least without doing some research, compatibility with Visual Basic. you might have to open a support incident or post a question on the Micro Focus community website to get answers about that.
Okay. Another question is, this is a long one. Only recently supporting Micro Focus COBOL in our dev and prod environments on Solaris. Now have a project to lift and shift into cloud on RHEL Linux. Can I just use Visual COBOL Eclipse to use in dev and also as a runtime in prod? In other words, do I need Server Express at all?
All right, two-part answer. The Visual COBOL is the development tool. So it's effectively the replacement for Server Express as a development tool. However, to deploy into a production environment, you need to have the companion runtime only product named COBOL Server to run it in beyond development. So beyond development environments, you'd be using the COBOL product. So you'd use Visual COBOL to do your development, and you'd be able to compile your code as you did in Server Express. And then as you deployed into environments beyond development, you'd need to use the COBOL Server product instead. But that's correct. The question you asked at the end, you don't need Server Express at all in that scenario.
Okay, thanks. All right, we have a few more questions here. Can we trade in a Unix license for Linux, or do we have to buy a new one?
I think you're going to have to work with your Micro Focus account manager to determine what the requirements are to move to a new platform. That's beyond the scope of what I can really address from customer support.
Okay, that's fair enough. A question. We got another question here. Do you need to use a separate pre-compiler to enable interface to database such as MySQL, DB2, SQL Server, etc.?
Micro Focus provides some support for working with separate pre-compilers from database vendors. However, also included in the Micro Focus products is OpenESQL, which is an internal compilation of a program with embedded SQL. I think the general rule of thumb to answer your question or to give you an idea where to go next is that if your application includes ANSI standard COBOL and nothing that is specific to a particular vendor's ANSI standard SQL and nothing specific to a particular vendor's implementation of SQL, then you might be able to use the embedded OpenESQL support and not need third-party precompilers. But there is some support for third-party precompilers in the product.
Okay. Okay. Here's another question. I tried to install MFBD on a RHEL instance with Eclipse, but the IDE did not work. Micro Focus said it was not supported in 4.0. Has it been implemented in 5.0 or 6.0?
As far as I'm aware, there is support, but it sounds like you've already been working with a support incident on this issue. I think the best thing for you to do is contact me offline, blair.mcdonald@microfocus.com, and I can check to see whether in your circumstance, with the details you had, this support is available in 5.0 or 6.0.
All right. Well, that looks to be the end of the questions, unless any come in. We'll give anyone a last chance to ask any questions here if they'd like. Otherwise, we could probably move on. Okay, it looks like that's the end of the questions. So as Blair said, please reach out to either of the speakers if you have any additional questions. And also there are relevant knowledge-based articles on the Micro Focus website. And we want to encourage you to register for upcoming events on the Visual COBOL. Links to these events will be included in the upcoming email following this webinar. So the upcoming events will be listed on the community calendar under the news and events on the website. Be sure to register for any Vivid events that are relevant to your area of expertise and let your colleagues and customers know as well, please. You can also check out the Espresso Talks for timely, relevant information. So that concludes today's webinar. We want to thank you all for attending today's Vivid COBOL SIG webinar. Please be sure to complete the short survey after the webinar ends, as we would love your feedback. And just a reminder that the on-demand recordings and slide deck will be posted to the Vivid website. In the next few days, you will receive an email with those links. So again, we'd like to thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at future webinars.